Julian, welcome back for the second part of our interview.
Thank you.
And thanks for sharing your perspective on Australia and some of the compliance trends in your background. Now, speaking more generally about your white paper, Contemporary Trends in Conduct Risk, you address quarterly financial performance.
Sure.
And in it you state, quote, strong financial performance is not antithetical to strong ethical performance. Often the two can go hand in hand, unquote. But you add, quote, putting pressure on sales staff can lead to cutting corners on compliance and legal requirements, unquote. Well, we talked about this at our roundtables last year, but Julian, for companies that want to grow, especially in frontier markets where risk and lucrative business opportunities are intertwined, how do ethics and compliance get aligned with business growth and stay aligned with business growth?
Yeah, look, I think the issue is that we've brought it into the business community this binary relationship between risk and reward. And I think humans are much more complex than that. We have different incentives and motivators within us. And to bring us down to this, issue of we're just going to be rewarded for achieving one particular outcome, I think is very one-dimensional.
Right.
What we are talking about when we're trying to fix culture and conduct risk issues is actually understanding the whole of the organization and how that organization fits within a country or a culture or as a global citizen. We expect that our businesses will behave in a way that doesn't negatively affect the general population, doesn't negatively affect their employees, and doesn't negatively affect their competitors. And I think we need to hold our organizations to a higher standard. The issue that I see around quarterly financials and going for target all the time is that it's coming from the shareholder base who are looking at these organizations as though it's a gambling mentality.
Okay.
I'm putting my money in and I'm going to hopefully get a return within 3 to 6 months.
Sure.
And I'll be the winner. Well, that's not how we want our businesses to be run when we think about it more broadly. So we need to move away from that. And it's not easy because it's kind of embedded in all of our cultures.
Sure.
Short-term risk, short-term reward. And I think that causes a lot of problems in organizations.
So for some of your clients, have you seen them take the corruption risk that exists in some of the regions in the world where Australian companies operate engineering, minerals? Are they embedding that corruption risk in how they compensate people, in how they sort of roll out their business strategies where that risk is embedded in their business strategy?
I'm not sure that there is anyone I'm aware of that is really looking at the whole of the issue.
Okay.
But there's certainly discussion around it at the moment. And that discussion might be as simple as let's make sure we have the compliance and ethics people sitting in on the remuneration committee.
Okay.
So let's understand what dynamic we're trying to achieve, and if we put a high bonus or a high commission into someone's pay packet, what is that going to incentivize them to do? And I think that's a really nice step that we're saying, well, hang on, let's look at this more broadly.
That's interesting. There was a recent Wall Street Journal article about does compliance have a seat at the strategy table, just like you referenced. A recent survey said 58% said they don't. But like you said, when they do, at least they're part of the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. There was an Alex cartoon that I saw the other day. I don't know if you get Alex here, but it's talking about the new CEO of a bank came from the compliance division.
Wow.
And the cartoon was basically saying, what a disaster.
Right.
No one will get anything done. But the reality is that bank might survive. And even in the US here, we're talking, there's a lot of talk now about breaking up the big banks.
Right.
Should the populace be supporting the banks that are too big to fail? Well, I think we're in a situation where that's going to be too difficult to do. So we need to look at how those organizations can behave better as part of the community.
And it sounds like what you're sharing is that in the context of a publicly listed company where there's quarterly earnings, there's quarterly reporting, that risk maybe gets elevated because you're always looking at what's the next quarter look like?
Sure, sure. And I think a certain amount of the blame has to go to the investors themselves. You can't, as an investor, be divorced from the culture of the organization that you're investing in. And if you're insisting, and the rest of the investor community is insisting on quarterly growth time and time again without looking at the longer term, then we're going to get performance that's based on that.
Right.
And the cultural issues that come as a result of that.
Interesting. There was one pharmaceutical company that has gotten into some FCPA trouble in a few different regions, and finally one of their, I think it was the chief medical officer, said, I think we're going to have to roll our business plans back to roll compliance forward.
Right, yeah. Oh, I think that's totally valid, because what's the alternative? They'll end up being out of business.
Right.
So is that a good outcome for those investors to lose all of their money?
Yeah.
No. Yeah. So I think there is a good argument for understanding where compliance can actually enhance your business. And for too long, we've seen it as a roadblock.
As opposed to a partner to
sure.
growth.
Yeah.
Interesting. So in your section, mission, vision, and values, you talk about culture, which can, quote, be replicated by others where there are no specific rules, unquote. Now, Julian, that sounds great, but how do you get that done? Is there a rule book for how you guide behavior for where there are no rules?
I think there has to be. We cannot regulate for everything. We cannot draft a policy for every potential behavior. And inevitably, a lot of that training and policy has only been drafted in reaction to some form of failure.
Sure.
And we don't know what tomorrow's failure will be. So what we want is a culture that understands and guides people where there are no rules. So, I was looking at some training issues the other day. One of the large banks had been issuing new staff with a cheat sheet so they could get through their compliance training.
Okay.
Right? So this says a lot about the culture.
Sure.
Now, this is going back a few years, and it's quite a funny story if you think about it. The management brings in the new recruit and says, son, you've got to do your compliance training. Here's the answers. The next organization, that I saw publicized, there was an article in one of our papers the other day that said Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan had just sacked people for cheating on their compliance training.
Right.
Now, you don't have to sack a lot of people to know that it's not tolerated in that organization. It sends a huge message that that's not tolerated. And I think that's a really wonderful thing to do. In fact, you only have to sack one person. As long as it's highly publicized, it sends that message down through the organization. And I think those sort of indicators, those sort of cultures, will help us where there are no rules.
Okay.
If you see what I mean.
Sure.
Yeah.
And how do you help companies, because there's culture from here's an email alert from the CEO, here's culture from a proclamation at Davos. How do you drive that down where people are working far away from the home office, often thinly supervised, and there's a lack of support personnel?
Yeah.
How do you get culture out there?
Well, I think there's two issues there. One is that we can't just be throwing a slogan up on the wall and saying that's our mission, vision, and values. Too many people do that, and they all look the same. Yeah. You can do a scan of most of the large corporations. They've all got the same sort of wording, just slightly changed. So we actually have to be talking about it almost every day, almost every communication that comes out, not just from the CEO, but all the way through that organization. We often talk about tone at the top when we're talking about compliance, but I actually think tone at the middle is where the real problems start. It's the people out there in the field. It's the people handing out the cheat sheets. The CEO is not going to endorse that. We know that. So the tone at the top's probably fine. Tone at the middle, I think, is really where we have an issue. And I think it starts with recruitment.
Really?
I really do. I think you've got to recruit not just for technical ability, but also for cultural fit. And I think that that's a really essential part of the mix. Certainly in our organization, we do that. And we have, first a technical interview. Can this person do the job? Second is a relaxed, go and meet the team. Do we all get along? Have we got the same sort of cultural values? Are we going to enjoy working with this person? And I think that's a really good filter, because human beings know when to trust somebody.
Interesting. So there's a little bit of a narrative to the hiring process to say, is this a person that has a good cultural fit?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I always, think about, does the message from the middle resonate get the business done much louder than the message of we still care how you get the business done.
Well, I think that message has to come from the top.
Right.
When businesses are doing it tough, there's often a sort of push from the CEO down. What can we do to get more business? How can we get our numbers up?
Sure.
That happens. It's either a quarterly number, an annual number, that sort of thing. But do you then accept that you might be taking on business that you perhaps shouldn't be taking on, or you're taking too much risk? Or is the CEO strong enough to go back to the board and say, hey, we're going to have a tough quarter.
Right.
There's a reason for it.
Sure.
Next quarter we'll do better. But for the moment, we're not going to take on bad business just to get our numbers up. And I think that sort of strength is rare, but it'll be more important if we're going to see longevity in businesses.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think shareholders are going to punish a company for saying we're projecting more conservative growth because of the risk that we face.
Sure.
And not wanting to get into a massive regulatory entanglement with investigatory costs and legal costs.
Absolutely.
Forget about the fines at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen the size of those fines.
Right.
Where people have cut corners and they've got the fines and the time taken away from management and all the litigation costs, and it's going to be very detrimental to your business to get yourself into that position. A lot worse than just having a bad quarter.
Absolutely.
And there was a book written in the 90s called Built to Last, and it looked at those businesses that had survived in America for over 100 years and those that hadn't. And those that have had really good, strong cultures. Those that had not necessarily family values, but values that people could attach themselves to. And I think we're all like that. We want to be part of a community. We want to be part of a good organization. We want to work for good companies.
Excellent. Well, let's stick with culture for a minute. This was very interesting. You go on in the white paper to state that, quote, changing attitudes in society and the evolution of culture can sometimes be at odds with our established set of rules or laws, unquote. Can you give me an example of that, past or present? And how could a compliance organization address such a situation where you might be swimming upstream, so to speak?
Sure, yeah. Look, I think the most obvious examples are happening right here in America.
Okay.
The legalization of marijuana is a huge change in attitude.
Sure.
5 years ago, it was, really bad, serious crime. So there's an attitude that's, changed. Or I think the attitude probably changed before the legislation changed.
Right.
Right? And we're looking at that and saying, well, hang on, all these kids are getting criminal records, and we're not actually solving the problem with the war on drugs. The same goes for same-sex marriage.
Right.
Where America has led countries like Australia, we still don't have same-sex marriage. And yet, this is something that is being sort of accepted on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
I find very few people who know a good argument for why we wouldn't have same-sex marriage. So I think we're seeing society leading legislation there, which is great, and maybe it'll get more conservative and change back at some point.
But there is a tension.
There is always a tension, but that makes life interesting.
Absolutely. Well, one more question on culture, and as we discussed, I have a little bit of a jaded view of it, but mostly because, as I shared, what I think frontline personnel hear the loudest is the culture from their regional sales manager, especially during those quarterly sales calls and forecasts. So where do you think, when you go into your clients, where do you try to get them to focus on in terms of their culture? Is it really driving it into the middle? Is it more at the CEO level, or all the above?
I think the middle for us is really where it's got to hit. We use technology to get out to the masses. E-learning is not about training 10 people, it's about training 10,000, training 100,000. The same if we're using policy software or any of those sort of tools or techniques. It's about getting that communication out to those people on a regular basis and engaging with them in a way that is interesting, not just throwing dry legislation at them, not just throwing, standard mission, vision and value statements at them, but trying to contextualize it so that it's relevant within their work environment. But also understanding that we need to trim it back and not overburden them with far too much information. And we feel that if we're doing that and we're adding value to these people's day-to-day jobs, their day-to-day careers, then they're going to understand what the CEO is driving at. The CEO knows what they need to be doing or should do. We might do some board level stuff, but in general, we're looking at the greater populations.
Right. And does the SALT compliance platform from GRC Solutions address that sort of cultural narrative?
Exactly.
In the training?
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. So we're not just looking at blanket. Here's 40 hours of training that you guys have to do every year. But we try and work to understand the job roles that they have in their organization and the individual risk profiles that those job roles have. And if we can do that little bit of work up front, and maybe it's not such a small amount of work, it could be a large amount, but we find that the impact that the training has is much more powerful.
And does the SALT compliance training platform, does that address training across issues like anti-money laundering, anti-bribery compliance?
Yeah, so we have a library of content that we've developed over the years, and our team keeps it all legally up to date, looking at everything from issues like sexual harassment, discrimination, through to anti-bribery, of course, anti-money laundering, insider trading, continuous disclosure, all of those issues. So there's a real broad raft of topics, and we deal with that by building jurisdictional versions and non-jurisdictional versions.
Okay.
So for something like anti-bribery, we find that most people will want a non-jurisdictional version or a multi-jurisdictional version, looking at what's happening in America, looking at what's happening in UK, but also touching on different issues. We're seeing new legislation coming out of countries like Canada, countries like Hong Kong, and we need to keep people up to date, but we need to look at it as a general principles overview from the company's perspective, not worrying too much about if I get caught in America, I'm in trouble. But if I'm in the UK, I'm fine. Well, that doesn't work.
That's not the right thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
And is this an e-learning program? Is it something that's on a desktop or?
Yeah, so we set that up as an e-learning portal for each of our clients, and we can either have it run through our platform or run through their normal learning management platform. So depending on what their organization already has in place, we tend to plug and play and fill those gaps. Where we differentiate is that we look at it from very much a compliance point of view. So it's not just any normal training piece of software. And all of the reporting that we provide is based on what does the compliance manager need to know. And what will, if the regulator came in tomorrow, what could they show them? Could they press a button and say, here's our results, this is where we're up to, this is where the gaps are, and this is what we're doing to fill those gaps.
So it sounds like it's matrixed to the organization, to the compliance department within that, but also to the particular issue, whether it's sexual harassment or anti-bribery.
Sure, yeah, exactly.
Well, great. Well, thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Richard.
Appreciate it.